Hi, everyone. Welcome to Investing Counterpoint. And today we have a great episode. I have Lewis Black, who is the CEO of Almonty. Almonty is a tungsten mining corporation. I'm going to let Lewis tell you all about it, but he's got some exciting things in the works here today. They're opening up a new mine in South Korea, and they have mining operations currently in Spain and Portugal. And we're going to hear about what it takes to mine tungsten. We're going to hear about the risks in mining, the risks in the supply chain, the risks in the commodity price. And so we have a lot to talk about today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lewis Black. Lewis, how are you?
Hi, Ian. How are you doing?
Doing great, thank you. So, Lewis, can you tell us just like a 30,000 foot view about Almonty? I know you guys have been around for a while. Just how it got started and just a little bit about Almonty Industries.
Well, we've done this for a long time. One of our mines in Portugal has been going for 126 years.
Oh, wow.
And has seen pretty much every historical event in the 20th century and into the 21st. So it has a long and varied history because, of course, tungsten is used in pretty much every part of the economy. But defense is always the one that sort of stands out. And so they've seen some interesting moments in history as such. But ultimately, we are basically the last man standing. 90% of the world's tungsten is produced between China and Russia. And we've managed to stay around because of this experience, this 5 generations of experience has taught us to be lean, creative, and we've developed a great deal of technology to process a very difficult metal. It's a very difficult metal to process.
Interesting. I'm really actually anxious to hear a lot more about that. So I did know that most of the tungsten was produced in China and Russia. And so you have these 2 mines in Europe and you're opening one in South Korea. Is that correct?
Yeah, the South Korean mine was formerly the world's largest tungsten mine. It shut in 92. At the beginning of the 80s, there was about 100 tungsten mines outside of China around the world. And then China arrived with sort of giveaway product. And by the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, there were 2 mines left out of the 100 or so. So this was a victim of that sort of price capitulation. And the government were very respectful towards this mine because it accounted for about 30% of GDP after the Korean War. And it created a lot of the large corporations in South Korea now, like, Tagitech, Pusan, POSCO. They were all created by this mine. So it has an enormous mythical, legendary status in country.
Wow.
And so it was very much preserved.
What's it called? The mine?
Samdong. The mine is called Samdong.
Wow.
There was, and it was a military-run organization. So a 3-star general was the general manager. Even to this day, the local residents salute you rather than shake hands. So it's still got that sort of legacy. And in the old days, it was where everyone who was at the intellectual cutting edge of academia, they would work at this mine. There was about 40,000 people working there, and you could go anywhere in the country in the overalls, and they would give you instant credit. Didn't matter where you went, as long as you had your uniform from this mine, you would have automatic credit.
Wow. And then China came along in the late
in the
80s, 90s, and basically kind of flooded the market with cheap tungsten. Is that what happened?
Essentially, but they did this with a number of products. I mean, it was essentially buying market share. There was a moment where Western governments fell out of love with mines. We had the miners' strike in the UK. There was environmental damages in South America. So it was no longer a sort of vote-winning process.
Yeah.
And China took an opportunity and they bought market share by setting market pricing at such a low point that it was impossible for these mines to survive.
So these mines so I'm imagining that the tungsten mine in Portugal, for example, that you said has been around for 120 years. It was always a tungsten mine, right? There's nothing else to mine there except for tungsten.
It was always a tungsten mine, but it survived because it produces the highest grade tungsten in the world. It's a very coveted product. And it was one of the 2 that survived.
Interesting.
And so it was in quite a unique situation.
So I'm going to ask a couple of probably pretty stupid questions here, but I'm imagining the audience might have them too. What is, so I know tungsten's used in a lot of different things, but especially back in the early 1900s, what was tungsten used for then? I know it's the hardest metal that is mined, but what was it used for?
On a very kind of I suppose obvious level, The wire filaments in light bulbs was one element. Any type of tools, cutting tools, whether it be for mining, whether for manufacturing, and it was used in braking systems. It was used in munitions. So it's for armaments, both for armor for tanks, shells, artillery shells. And then as we kind of evolved through the 20th century, the uses of tungsten just continue to increase. So it's used in aerospace. If you want to manufacture a plane, you need to put 3 million rivet holes, for instance, in an airline, and you need a tungsten insert to be able to do that. In cars, in gears, in braking systems, in wiring looms. And then into the modern day, we use it they use tungsten gas in every semiconductor. You use it in screens, in your phones, in television. So you use it anodes and cathodes, so allow you to charge batteries much quicker for EVs. So it's actually a very unique metal. It is really the only metal that you find in every single economic sector that is in operation. But you only use a little bit of it in its application. But without it, the application doesn't work.
So that's what I find so interesting about it. So, when we think of mines, we think of things like, gold, silver, coal. I mean, anything that kind of comes out of the ground in these massive quantities, especially if you have an image of coal, you get these big, huge coal piles and things like that. But I imagine tungsten isn't mined in the same way, or is it? I mean, what are the differences between mining something like a gold and a tungsten in terms of like the technology to extract it?
Well, gold and tungsten share the same density. So theoretically, you use similar processes like gravity to separate it. The difference with tungsten, and it's considered essentially by all chemists as an alien metal because it has some very strange properties that don't exist anywhere else on the planet in any other element. As you said, its melting temperature is slightly less than the temperature of the sun, so it's very durable, but it's very brittle. So if you drop it, it shatters into 1,000 pieces. Oh, wow. And that sort of state of being very brittle makes processing it very difficult because you have to blast to extract it. You then have to crush it to a certain size, and then you have to refine it to concentrate it in a plant. And so all these handling processes, you can have tungsten dissipate because every time you touch it, it dissipates. So it's a real art to process it. And unfortunately, given what happened in the 80s, most of that knowledge in the West is long gone. The guys who have it are either having their dinners through straws, are sitting on an urn on someone's mantelpiece, or are basically talking to the wall. So that knowledge has basically gone. And that, I think, has certainly made this push for greater diversity, given its importance, strategic importance. It's a number one metal on pretty much every Western government's list. It's made it very difficult because if you don't have the knowledge to process it, how can you actually go ahead and actually do that?
So I mean, especially with the Ukraine war, I mean, it's always been something with China, and there's always been the tensions with China and things like that. But we've had good trade for quite some time. Russia, even the same thing until the Ukraine war, when we started to put on these massive tariffs, obviously sanctions, and tungsten was affected, wasn't it, with us?
No, not at all. Because if you look at the sanctions we put onto Russia, we confiscated some oligarchs' yachts, and I think they said that they were banning Russian gold. But of course, gold is the most efficiently smuggled metal in the world. I mean, they've been doing it for 4,000 years. They've become very good at it. So it's almost impossible to say whether gold comes from Russia or Timbuktu. Right. It's kind of, it's gold, it's bullion. But all other commodities, all other raw materials produced in Russia just went a different routes. Instead of going via the EU, now they go via China. So nothing's really changed. Yeah. I think the main problem tungsten has always had is all of our customers who are all vertical, and they all go all the way through to the finished products of screens or tools or munitions. Nobody really wants to talk about the problem because they're all terrified of the hand that feeds them from biting it off. And so it's really between a rock and a hard place. Apple has been the only company that said anything publicly about tungsten, which was they weren't going to be using Russian tungsten in their iPhones. Unfortunately, it's almost impossible to say whether the tungsten you're using is Russian or not. Right. Because once it now heads into China, it becomes, who knows. But at least one company stood up and said, you know what, this is something which we've identified as an issue and we have to address it.
This mine in Portugal has been around for 120 years, and the one in South Korea has been around for a long time, but kind of defunct since the late 80s, early 90s. How did you and Almonty get into, well, first, I mean, let's start at, I guess, at the beginning, whether it was Spain or Portugal. I mean, how did you acquire those mines? How did you get involved in those mines? And you guys went public, about 10 years ago. I don't know how long Almonty's been around, but how, what were the start of those operations for you?
Well, Portugal was our first acquisition many years ago, almost, I suppose, about 16, 17 years ago. And my business partner and I were very interested in the idea of tungsten because you need very little of it for the end process. And without it, the end process doesn't work. And therefore, it should never really have been price determined. It should be supply determined. Mm-hmm. You must have it. And we're also fascinated by the fact that there are virtually no mines that can claim over a century in operation. And that also fascinated us.
Yeah.
We bought it, we rehabilitated it because it was in a pretty bad state. I mean, the previous owners, I don't want to cast aspersions, but they were looking to run it into the ground, into bankruptcy, so that the government would then be responsible for the reclamation. And it was a bit, it was the typical junior miner outlook on how to deal with a problem, is make it someone else's. But so we acquired it, we renovated it, and within 2.5 years, Sojitz Corporation in Japan offered us 21 times earnings and we sold it. But then, so we left the sector and then we came back at the request of customers because we'd done, I believe, a very good job in Portugal. We reacquired Portugal back from the Japanese because mines, operating a mine is not easy.
I'm sure.
Especially if you use consultants, and consultants don't actually know anything about tungsten extraction because, as I said, that knowledge disappeared many years ago. But we still maintain a very friendly relationship with Sojitz. And I think all in all, we then started to consolidate every site that we felt met the criteria of the customers, which was longevity, transparency, and being in jurisdictions where the president's son wouldn't wake up one day and decide that he wants to be in the tungsten business and repaint the front door.
Right. Which is very important.
Well, it happens. And,
it does, yeah, absolutely.
And if you're in, a very sensitive part of any global economy, which a lot of our end users are, you need absolute transparency from soup to nuts. And to be honest, if you operate outside of a democracy, that's almost impossible to provide. I think there was always a market for what we were trying to do. Has operating in democracies got easier? Absolutely not. It's not for the faint-hearted, but we sleep at night. And I think that makes the difference.
Yeah.
And it is a highly regulated environment to operate in. South Korea is a good example. It took us 4 years to redesign it from a mine, a brownfields mine that was conceived in the earlier 20th century, where if you didn't have a death in a week, it was a good safety week, which is extraordinary. And we brought it into what they call equator principles, which is the highest level of ESG compliance in the world. And we had to do it in a way that was commercially viable. So it takes time as an operator to be able to do it. But mines are now a very different animal than they were even 10 years ago.
I'm sure.
They really have become not a blot on the landscape. They now are totally immersed and integrated with the environment and their community. I mean, everything is recycled, water. This essentially, you have farming, bizarrely, has more impact on the landscape now than a mine. I mean, not an underground mine especially, but of course, open pit is different, but then it's reclaimed afterwards. So it is a very different undertaking, but it's not easy in a democracy at all.
So let me ask you about the, we've had with COVID and everything like that, we have had some serious supply chain issues in terms of not just of the metals and things like that, but what about starting a mine during this time? I mean, so like you're repurposing, like you said, or rehabilitating the South Korean mine. I mean, the technology is completely different than it was, I imagine, from the 1980s. I don't know exactly what's different because it's not my area of expertise at all, but I imagine that things must have progressed, dramatically in those 30 or 40 years. What has it been like trying to open that, besides like the bureaucratic mess? I mean, is it easy to get the mining technology from one place to another? Is that difficult? I mean, you're in such a specialty area. I imagine it's not, even though it's the same as gold, it can't be exactly the same in terms of what those.
No. I mean, technology-wise, it's probably, any build, the process that you use is probably the simplest part of the equation, because it's a process you've worked with it for many years, you're comfortable with it. Where the drama comes in is you've got to build it. So you're building in a different country. You have to really immerse yourself in the whole culture, because what upsets, say, for instance, me, it's not necessarily what upsets anybody in Korea. and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So you have, and you can't win. You mean there's no way you're ever going to convince them to be upset about the same thing you are. So you have to very quickly understand how to be upset at the same time as they are, even if it's counterintuitive. So I think culturally it is a journey, and it's very important. This is a Korean project. We are literally, it's got 100+ years of reserves in it.
Wow.
So we are literally just the instigators of the reemergence of this project. Ultimately, the makeup of this mine will always be Korean. Mm-hmm. It's because it has to be. It's important that it is. It's part of the community. So I think that's probably been the biggest hurdle is trying to really understand and operate in an entirely new and different culture. And to know how to deal with that, diplomatically and with sensitivity. But the technology side, that's straightforward. The being in this environment is more difficult.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What about the so we touched on this for a moment before the call, but I was looking up tungsten because tungsten is not the most traded of commodities in the world, even though, like you said, it's used in absolutely everything. And so it surprises me that it's not a little more highly traded of a commodity compared to some of the others. I mean, I know copper and gold and silver are obviously very liquid commodities. But as a CEO, how do you think about the pricing? You mentioned that it should be more demand driven than supply driven, but there's a big difference between tungsten from your perspective at $400 versus $200. And so how do you manage that risk within the pricing in terms of like running your mines, or is it just something is there a point where it's not profitable to run the mine, like when all these mines went out of business?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And I think the pricing mechanism, it's quoted by the London Metal Bulletin every week, but it's essentially a Chinese controlled price. And of course, China, to maintain market share, is not just about being, a good supplier, holding inventory. There's also the fact that you keep pricing within a certain band, and that discourages others from opening. The difference is that we've always been profitable in that sector because we have very good technology that we've developed, not just recently, but over a period of 100 years. So that's always given us that edge. But I agree, in terms of managing risk, there are no futures contracts. You can't publicly trade this commodity. Otherwise, it would be at the same sort of levels of molybdenum right now, which is publicly traded because defense is really driving consumption of tungsten. And we do things, for instance, in the South Korean project, we have offtakes with our customers, which have a hard floor and no cap on the upside. So even if the price China decides, let's revisit the 1980s again, we're going to be unaffected in Korea because we have a hard floor. So it cannot go below a certain price. And that price has all kinds of escalators built within it to ensure that we can still have a successful year. And then if the price goes through the roof, we don't have any cap on that. So these are the mechanisms that we've had to work with our customers, because our survival and our transparency has great value to the supply chain because we're it.
Yeah.
So we are able to attract, a lot of these very, unusual but very helpful instruments. Our main problem has always been, as a public company, is that we've never really brought any of this to the wider market because we are operators first and foremost. So we find ourselves in a very strategically important position, but without that value being recognized at this moment, which is one of the reasons we are now taking this story, because we are in the final throes of reopening Korea.
Right.
It's to demonstrate to a wider market that, we are the big dog.
So is Korea, so when you say that, so you have a floor, I mean, obviously the floor is, when the customers agree to that's great. But if if the floor is, let's just say 200 and China decides that they're going to go down to 100 or $50, there's a point where your supplier, where your customers must not be, and I don't know what that is because it doesn't look like it's been reached in a while, but is this like a government subsidized type of thing where they'll take the floor, or no?
No, these customers are all AAA rated, vast organizations.
Interesting. Okay. So because it does seem like it's a national interest type of thing to me to have something like tungsten, which is used in everything, not controlled by just China and Russia. And
if they have their own, arrangements with, their consumers, the Teslas and the Apples and the IBMs, or with their governments, that is beyond my pay grade.
Got it. Yeah, got it. Interesting. So where else is tungsten in the world? You mentioned that there were, I mean, I forget how many hundreds of mines. You said there were 100 plus mines that were in operation before the 80s. Where are they all? What happened to them all? Is this something in terms of like, your long-term expansion plans once you, I imagine financing this is not cheap or easy. So, you probably have to bring some profitability in before you're able to just move on to the next project. But is that something that's in the plans of Almonty?
We think we've identified pretty much every project that it's worth its salt. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, tungsten was more valuable than gold because of defense. And, every man and his dog was out mining tungsten. So a lot of the projects in the US were mined out. Those in Canada are very far in the north in the Yukon, making conditions very difficult to work in.
Yeah.
There are artisanal mines, which is essentially small groups of collectors, almost in Africa, in Mongolia, in Brazil, in Peru, Bolivia, but nothing of any great longevity. And the sort of large longevity mines that are left, you find in China and Russia. So I think that the one unique thing about Korea is that we have a design parameter for its output, but the deposit is so vast that if going forward, our customers or the wider consuming community said, look, we have to continue to expand its output, it is achievable. So we don't really need to look elsewhere when we have a resource that is going to almost certainly outlive all of us to start with, and probably our kids as well. So we'll focus on Korea.
So that's a little like, it seems to me it's a little bit like, Saudi Arabian oil, where they can just be like, okay, well, customers need more. We need more supply in the system. We can just turn it up, and it's so cheap for them to do it. Like once it's there, the cost isn't so incrementally prohibitive for you to increase your production. No, it's cheaper for you to increase your production than it is to go try to find a new mine.
Yes, for instance, in Korea, we can double our throughput, which is double our production, for $17.5 million. It's a nothing amount of money to double your output.
Yeah.
And the one thing this mine does have is, of course, we also have a vast amount of molybdenum that's also 150 meters from our existing underground infrastructure. So, and of course, moly is used prolifically in Korea and as well as around the world. So this mine is a very, very geologically unique resource. We're very fortunate to have been able to acquire it.
That's great. Excellent. Louis, it's been great having you on the show today. This has been really, really interesting. One last question that I have before I go is about, you mentioned something that there's no futures in tungsten. Is there any way to hedge that risk that you guys might have? And I guess the floor is your hedge. I mean, you've developed, very, very wisely into your business model, a sort of a hedge. You have with a floor, but is there any other way to, that is your hedge, right? So there's no need to find another commodity or anything else that acts like tungsten, because you are hedged.
Yes, I would love a futures contract to exist, but the liquidity isn't there, and so it's not going to happen anytime soon. So we had to find our own solution to this hedge to protect us on the downside.
Yeah. Would you? Has there been an attempt to make a more liquid? I know it's not just someone attempting to make a futures contract, but it seems like something that's used in absolutely everything, even though it's small amounts, would kind of be something that would naturally have a contract. But I guess maybe there's just not enough operators that need the hedge, since you're kind of outside of China and Russia.
I think that's probably true, as well as the fact that the customer base is very consolidated. Some of these are the largest corporations in the world, and they are predominantly vertically integrated, except for the raw material, which is what we provide.
Sorry, I was going to say, I'd imagine the cost to the customer of the raw material being 200 versus 400 is not night and day because of the small amount that they use.
Exactly. They don't, listen, they always complain about what they pay. This is absolutely normal. This is what customers do. Unless I'm paying them to take it off my hands, they're never truly happy. But they also use so little of it in the end process that it becomes a rounding error on their balance sheet, whether they pay 200 or 1,000. So
that's really interesting. Man, what a unique business that you have there, Louis. It's really, really fascinating. This was a really interesting conversation. I really appreciate you being on the show today. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks for having me.